Welcome to the Jane's Walk Festival 2020 panel discussions.
So official hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Jane's Walk Toronto Festival's Moving Through Space panel. My name is Nadia Galati. I'm an urban planner and designer based here in Toronto, and I run a studio called Process with Sarah Udo. Process is a team of urban planners and artists working in collaboration and creative process to transform how we plan, design, and experience places and communities at the intersection of planning, design, people, user research, consultation, cultural planning, and public art. We're in an unprecedented time with COVID-19 that has affected all of our lives and upended many routines. And we hope you have been enjoying this reimagined Jane's Walk Festival and look forward to having all of you participate in the activities taking place this weekend. Thank you again for being with us this afternoon. We really appreciate it. Before we officially begin the Moving Through Space panel, I want to start off with a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements are often said in shared physical spaces, yet today we're gathering virtually, but we are all still on land. So it's important to acknowledge the land that we are on. I acknowledge the land that I am standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuits, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. It's important for us to individually and collectively reflect on this land and consider our roles within truth and reconciliation. I'm a settler, and as a settler on this land, I'm committed to being an ally in the journey towards reconciliation. This involves sincerely facing truths about a horrific past, as well as fighting the continued systemic racism that exists today to work towards a more equitable future. So with that in mind, our panel discussion today, Moving Through Space, is going to focus on equity and mobility. COVID is a shared experience for globally, and it's provided lived lessons to learn from about cities because of the new restrictions on our mobility. Urban mobility, urban and mobility, they really go hand in hand. People who live in cities, we rely on movement. The mobility sector has been one of the industries most affected by the outbreak. And so over the next 45 minutes, 50 minutes or so, these great panelists who are about to officially be introduced, we're going to ground our discussion through a user-centered lens that considers societal values, data research to discuss the impact of COVID on mobility and the increased attention paid to the physical space of our streets, sidewalks, and transit vehicles. In my professional practice, I've always been very interested and committed to understanding the layers and intersections of experience when it comes to public space, public assets, different users of transit, policy, cultural programs, and COVID and mobility are no different. Depending on who you are, your lived experiences, your access to resources, your social capital, each and others have a direct impact on how folks are currently experiencing the pandemic and the experiences of the restrictions placed on people's mobility. So the COVID pandemic has underscored the critical role urban mobility plays in our daily lives and has highlighted how the current situation could change to create a more equitable system. So I want to give a huge thank you to Jane's Walk Toronto and the folks working really hard to continue to deliver this wonderful festival. Yes, big time, especially in the face of COVID, bringing together such wonderful groups of people and perspectives. And a big thank you for asking me to moderate. I'm very excited to now get started and to introduce our panelists. I'm going to give each of them a moment to introduce themselves. So the Moving Through Space panelists, first up, I'll hand it over to Daniel Rotsztain.
Hey, so glad to be here. I'm Daniel Rotsztain. I call myself the urban geographer, and I'm an artist, writer, and cartographer. And I'm really committed to understanding and supporting the city's social life. One of my projects is Plaza Pops, which is creating community gathering spaces on privately owned strip malls in the inner suburbs. And I recently I really believe in the power of art to communicate ideas and get, policy through. So I recently created with Bobby Gatta the social distance machine as part of the Toronto Public Space Committee to show how little space there is for us to navigate the city safely during COVID-19. And I was grateful that that video resonated in Toronto and beyond. So I'm looking forward. And I work with Nadia at Process as well. So looking forward to the discussion.
So next up, all the way from Copenhagen, Mikael Colville-Andersen, welcome.
Thank you, Mikael Colville-Andersen. Well, you just said that, but I am in Copenhagen. I am an urban designer. I work in urban planning, worked in 100 cities around the world trying to improve urban lives. And I'm the host of the documentary series about urbanism, The Life-Size City, which you can see on TVO in Canada, Link TV in the States, and other places as well. I'm obliged to tell you that. It's my job.
And hello, Candice Leung. Please introduce yourself. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Nadia, and thanks everyone at the Jane's Walk Toronto Festival coordination team. I've really been loving the festival this year and how quickly you guys have adopted this, safe physical distancing measures to make the festival possible. And I'm really excited to be on this panel today. When I'm not on a panel, I am a project coordinator with the Toronto-based non-for-profit organization 880 Cities, where much of our work is guided by the question of what if everything in a city was great for an 8-year-old and an 80-year-old towards creating great, equitable, age-friendly cities for everyone. Most of our work there focuses on mobility and public spaces. When I'm not working, I'm also a organizing member with a few grassroots transit advocacy organizations here in Toronto, specifically TDC Riders and Scarborough Transit Action.
Great. And finally, panelist number 4, Philiz, go. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm a registered nurse who care for oncology patients, specifically breast cancer patients throughout their cancer journey. I'm currently completing my master's in health systems leadership and administration in nursing in the University of Toronto, due to graduate this year. I'm on medical leave for the past few years following an accident that left me with a brain injury and with multiple accessibility needs. And I'm advocating for better accessibility spaces and needs since I've been able to. And I'm now completing my writing of my self-help book for acquired brain injuries, due to come out soon. So buy it whenever it comes out.
Thank you. So welcome everyone. Big thank you to each of you, and also a big thank you to all of you joining in on the discussion today, viewing. We've prepared some questions for our discussion, but of course we'll see where the discussion also goes. And for folks tuning in, we haven't planned a formal question and answer as part of this panel, but please feel free to submit questions using the platform's messaging system, and we're going to do our best to work them into the discussion if we can. So I think we're going to officially kick off our discussion with question number 1. Oh, one other thing for folks tuning in, I'm going to drop the questions into the messaging function so you can each see the question that was asked that folks are responding to just to keep our discussion moving. So panelists, we want you to answer, each of you to answer all of the questions. So I'm just going to ask it, and then please, whoever's first comfortable and ready, please respond. So number 1, in what ways has urban infrastructure and traditional public space advocacy failed to address the concerns of different users and different modes of movement, so such as wheelchair users, cyclists, pedestrians, BIPOC and LGBTQ2S folks, low-income folks, among others?
I'm happy to kind of give my 2 cents first, and then I welcome other panelists to jump in. So as I mentioned, a lot of the stuff that I do outside of my full-time job is working with transit advocacy. So TDC Riders and Scarborough Transit Action on a normal everyday life, we have various campaigns and groups, committees that work on different campaigns to get our transit to be a bit more equitable. One of those campaigns is around accessibility and the role that people with mobility, special mobility needs, and how they interact with our transit system. So on a normal day, we've really been looking at how we can expand all of our stations in Toronto to become more accessible. That means elevators where needed and things like that. But ever since COVID hit, we're noticing our Wheel-Trans system really kind of fall flat in preparing how we can interact with people. Before the panel formally started, we were kind of having a little bit of a conversation of the new barriers people are facing just to go to where they want to go, right? So an example of that is a committee member of mine, Adam Cohen. He uses wheeltrans fairly often, and they now have to call to place an order or place a request to pick up or something like that. So instead of, you know, just walking out of your house when you're a fully able body or possibly jumping into your car, for example, people that have accessibility needs are now facing that, not confrontation, but inquisitory incidents where they're being asked, you know, where are you going? How many times have you left? Oh, I see the log says that you actually already went for groceries, you know, a couple days ago. Do you really need to go out now? So these are all just new barriers that, again, more marginalized people are facing.
And then for my take on continuing with Candice, because I'm more for the accessibility view on things, I think traditional public spaces such as sidewalks fail to address wheelchair users and pedestrians by not being more spacious, because it is hard to fit both on it at the same time without the pedestrian being upset at the person in the wheelchair taking up more space. The transition also onto the road is also very lacking for wheelchairs from the sidewalks. And there are very bad paths for wheelchairs in the parks, and not a lot of sitting areas by benches or covered areas that is accessible without having to plow through tall grass to get to. As for urban infrastructures, some examples are those accessible door buttons. Don't usually work most of the time, and if they are available at the entrance, and most entrances in the Toronto have steps as well, or a step to enter the facility, and some places do place a makeshift ramp in front of their entrances, but unfortunately those ramps are too steep for someone with mobility issues to wheel themselves up with. And would need assistance. And for those who use canes or walkers, they don't really have railings for safety when you walk up those steep ramps. And if you do find yourself to get into the restaurant, and it's not wide enough for those accessible door buttons to get into the door sometimes, and they may not even have a bathroom on the main level. I'm not talking about accessible bathroom, just the bathroom itself. They're usually located in the basement. And also, most restaurants are quite tight when you get in. And the wheelchair is hitting everyone, and the chairs that you're getting through, to get your designated table. And then when you're sitting down, you feel kind of bad because your wheelchair is sticking out, and you're taking so much space in the restaurant, and everyone has to go around you, or they hit you every time they pass. Also, daily tasks like grocery shopping also pose issues, like having to reach for items in the upper shelf when you're in a wheelchair is very hard to reach, and trying to open those freezer doors with a mobility device can be difficult. So these are just some ideas and thoughts that I had about that.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about COVID is that it has exposed and emphasized the pre-existing issues, tensions, and inequities that existed before COVID-19. And in Toronto, there's pedestrian and mobility advocates have been, trying to advocate for greater pedestrian space, because the balance between those who have cars and those who don't is not very equal right now. And it's just like, you can't really ignore that now, especially with the streets so quiet. But so I'll talk about the project that has brought me to this panel, I think. So the social distance machine, we chose to go in Kensington Market in Yonge Street. Those are kind of streets that are close to me and close to my livelihoods. But I want to bring in a critique that Jay Pitter, author and placemaker, wrote for Azure magazine. And she talked about forgotten densities versus kind of these more dominant densities. And I think where my video failed and my advocacy failed was about talking about these parts of the city in the suburbs, in tower communities, in Toronto community housing, where there's even less of a ability to navigate, and that any advocacy for pedestrian space needs to incorporate that lens of equity. So that's kind of like where we want to be going forward with this conversation, and I appreciate all the voices that have been part of that conversation in Toronto. I recently read about New York City's initiative. So Toronto likes to compare itself to other cities when we want things. And New York, we talk about the 100 miles of pedestrian streets that they've been given, but then I kind of did a little deeper digging, and those streets are largely adjacent to parks, and they're largely in communities that already have access to public space. So we need to, when we're comparing ourselves to other cities, kind of be, look very closely and ensure that initiatives to open streets and open spaces are compared to that equity lens and where people need it most. So Yonge Street was brought up because you have tens of thousands of people living in an area with not that much public space, but we need to expand that conversation elsewhere. And I think that's what we need to lead with, is where do people need the space as opposed to where is it easiest. Another critique was with the Curb TO program in Toronto, it's a very economic lens. They're doing it just adjacent to grocery stores. And so why is the only reason that we're opening space in Toronto have to do with, commerce? It needs to be broader than that.
That's me, I guess. I think that really COVID has been the most amazing whistleblower, right? You got to try and spin something positive out of this horrible situation. But we realize all over the world that we have all of this space. The streets are empty, the air is clean, and COVID has given us this opportunity to look at our cities differently. And if you talk about mobility and just generally everything to do with urbanism, man, we have lived for 70, 80 years under this all dominant car-centric matrix of traffic engineering and urban planning, where the car is the primary vehicle and everybody else, we have to try and squeeze them, into this dominant matrix. And I think a lot of I think we're realizing that, a lot of the work that we've been doing in advocacy and in urbanism has been trying to squeeze things into this matrix. And we're realizing now that, oh, damn, there's a lot of space. Look, I call it the arrogance of space. We have all of this space allocated to, one person in a car, 12 square meters. And, we're realizing that, man, our cities could be different. So for me, the positive spin on this horrible situation is that people are realizing, wait, there's a lot of space there. Can we use it differently? We need wider sidewalks for social distancing in this crisis situation. We need better bike lanes. Pop-up bike lanes are happening in so many cities around the world. But I think really we're also exposing at the same time the fact that a lot of advocacy has just been playing the game of squeezing, little bits and pieces. Let's do some public seating here. Let's do a little thing here. All great ideas, but we have been dominated by this car-centric mentality. And now we're realizing, wait, maybe that was a flaw. Maybe we should be fighting the matrix, as it were. Maybe we should be not be content with our baby steps. Oh, I got a bench put in on this square, or I planted a tree. Maybe we should be raging against the machine now more than ever.
Thank you all. Really great responses, great different perspectives. And I wonder if you can build on your responses and think about, because we've talked about inequity across disparate communities. We've talked about misuse of or opportunities within space that have opened up and very clearly been underutilized or used differently, or inequities within systemic inequities embedded within urban infrastructure. Are there examples that you could speak to that have demonstrated possible change in the realm of accessible and inclusive public space that may have been as a result of COVID or emerging around the same time? But have there been some possible change to speak to some of the challenge that we've all discussed?
I'm going to jump back to what Daniel was mentioning a little bit earlier around the Curb TO approaches, and what we're seeing a lot of, online in the Twitter universe is these COVID streets, right? Various ways of using programmatic elements to calm a street or make a street a bit more safer for its most vulnerable road users, whether that's cyclists, pedestrians, children, older adults, so on and so forth. You've seen a lot of cities around the world, expanding their open streets programs, or, creating slow streets where it's only local residential traffic and things like that. When I think about how it's being applied, in Toronto and different parts of the world as well, it's not being applied equally, right? Mm-hmm. And to emphasize the point that Daniel was saying, how you know, we shouldn't have to make an economic case for people's well-being and their safety and their health and wanting to, you know, go outside and access these essential services and essential needs safely. We shouldn't have to justify, you know, with dollars and cents why we are going out for fresh air, why we need to be able to do that safely during these times. Really emphasizing the human role and the role that, you know, parents, families, individuals play in this ecosystem of urbanism is really, really important during these times, I think.
Yeah, and I think Oakland, California is an example that I've looked into, and they did like, you know, many streets everywhere. And I think, you know, part of what makes this work is if it's not, it can't be humble. It has to be kind of on a grand scale, because if you make one street a pedestrian street, that's kind of like that festival street and everybody will congregate there. So I think that in order for this to be successful, it needs to be spread out. It needs to be like a large number. And, it, you know, I think we're about to, you know, in Canada, we're talking about entering this next phase. And in order for us to do this in the long haul and to take care of ourselves, we need to be creating positive spaces and not just like hitting people on the hand about where they can go. It needs to be, you can come here, you like, you know, stay 6 feet apart, but we're giving you the space. And I think that requires like the scale that we've seen in places like Oakland.
Yeah, and building on that, like I noticed that, you know, the newer buildings have gone up recently in Toronto, have included more space with sidewalks and have accessible entrances and accessible bathrooms on the main floors. And I believe newer buildings are being more aware of accessibility now that you have to legally implement the AODA guidelines by 2025. And I believe that like the park space that's just redone near my house now is more accessible, paths for wheelchairs and accessible water fountains. So it's nice to see that accessibility is being included in the space. So I think that they're now more and more trying to be aware of that. But I hope that it's with the COVID, they're gonna be more aware to build this space into more of the building and urban infrastructure, as what Daniel was speaking about, to make it more of a culture than more of just a one-off thing.
I think there are so many things happening that are so interesting, and that's one of my optimistic moments is reading about all of these cities that are implementing wider sidewalks and pop-up bike lanes. New Zealand, the first country in the world to say, yeah, we need to put in pop-up bike lanes. The question remains, will they stay after the crisis fades away? But Berlin is a city to watch. They are putting in so many temporary bike lanes, but really Milan is the darling of this conversation, talking about wider sidewalks and public space. They are taking this opportunity to make temporary bike lanes, but they are saying already now that they will be permanent. And I've been involved in a discussion about the different streets in Milan and how they're doing it. They are doing it as we speak. People are painting new bike lanes and putting in barriers to keep cyclists and pedestrians safe. I think this is really an amazing opportunity for cities to, you know, instead of having to go through the whole process of, you know, public hearings and all that. Public hearings are important, it's democracy, but, you know, now we're saying we need this now. And this is so interesting to see how these cities are reacting to it. And it's going to be more interesting to see how many cities actually keep all of this infrastructure, whether it be bike lanes, wider sidewalks, accessibility issues, you name it, more access to parks, more parks, man. I think we're really realizing that, this is the discussion here in Copenhagen. People are going, I just realized I had a park like 20 meters from my house and I've never been there. And it's really nice. And people are realizing like we're exploring the city. We're discovering our own cities like we have never done before because we're busy with work. We got our kids, we got our, you know, got a date to go to, we got, you know, go drinking, whatever. But we're realizing that the city is ours. And this is really something that is, for me, going to have a knock-on effect. I think we're going to really realize that people are going to take ownership of their cities. And, you know, in 5 years, when we're discussing some urban planning project, some urban renewal in some neighborhood, in some city, people are going to say, hey, wait, yeah, you know, and they're going to refer to this time where they were aware of their city like they never have been before. So I think, you know, I always take that sort of the big picture perspective. I think we're really realizing that we have ownership of our cities, the citizens in our cities. And there are cities that are doing the right thing, and they are going, this is our opportunity, man. You know, we're gonna nail it now. And unfortunately, it's a minority of cities. It's not all of them, but they are still leadership cities that I think they're going to be the ones that we're going to look to in a very short time after the crisis and say, wow, you did that. We should have done that. How can we do it now? I think there's a lot of leadership out there, a lot of examples of positive urbanism being put into place. And I'm so interested to see what's going to happen in the next couple of years because of that.
This is an additional question, folks, and not the ones that have been shared with the panelists in advance. I'm just going to throw this out relative to harnessing and leveraging some of this energy. And like, we're talking about a shift in behavior, and we're talking about folks now, something that they may have been a pipe dream because they haven't had the experience of what it could be. And now all of a sudden we have this shared experience of change.
Mm-hmm.
And then first the change, also the question of parks and where are our green spaces located and where do we need more green spaces located relative to privilege and race and income and all sorts of things. But what is the value of, and is there a place then for education and community consultation and engagement around this to really harness this energy into the question of democracy and bringing folks into this shift so that it's not just a story we tell 5 years ago, but that we're, it's not just a bunch of urbanists speaking to urbanists about this, but how do we also shift the conversation to a larger body politic and get folks engaged in it as well?
Yeah, well, I know that building on what Mikael said, like we're all home and we're all kind of taking up our home spaces. And I think that's a wonderful energy to tap into, and that advocacy going forward needs to be about connecting all those efforts. So like we have a shared goal, which is, greater safety, greater, mobility being one of the most important things in an urban space. It's, how you get around and what access you have. And so I'm part of the Toronto Public Space Committee, which started, 15, 20 years ago and has kind of this downtown bias. And I know that people are trying to, expand, but I think like advocacy going forward is about linking this constellation of these local efforts. So, recognizing that we are in place and we know our homes best, but then like reaching out and seeing what those shared goals are and then advancing forward. So I see a really exciting structure of advocacy moving forward.
I'm going to dig more into that for sure. I want to hear more details on your thinking on that.
Yeah, and I think that getting all those information and ideas and cultures from the different countries in the world that have all these great ideas that's been coming and coming out should be siphoned into education, getting all the young ones to start thinking about our future and building that in. I think that's a great idea, because it should be coming out from and building into our future and have these young minds start to already think instead of having it be already too far behind. I think that's a great idea, and building it into our education system. And then of course, it'd be good to have it in our counselor into our Toronto counseling and have that begin discussion to say, hey, this needs to happen now. But I think that's a great idea to have it in our education system. That's a perfect idea.
Yeah, and I think, it's like, it's tempting to look at other cities a lot and to compare ourselves. But again, like we need to be really critical when we look at what other cities are doing. There was a comment like Mississauga, people are saying Mississauga has done it, but there was a gesture. It was not that much space. So we have to be really, what do we know? What is going on in our homes and what do we want? And, kind of advancing on what we know best as we move forward, as opposed to just being like, Mississauga is doing it. Why aren't we? Like, what are the reasons why we should be doing it? And how do we band together to do that?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, like, I think a lot of other cities are realizing that like this is a safe and supportive approach to expanding sidewalk spaces and things like that. But yes, every city is different. But what it really comes down to, I think, is a lot of like civic leadership at like a municipal level, but also in a community leadership role as well. I've actually been really impressed with New Zealand's approach to funding these tactical urbanism projects, to putting money aside to rolling them out, but also studying them and evaluating them and understanding what's working, where are the pressure points, how is this impacting people, trying to conduct some of that research engagement as much as possible, and being really quick to adjust your urbanist approach to a city right now in a post-COVID situation, right? Understanding, you know, where are those pressure points and how to adjust is really, really key.
I think it's important to just to consider the fact that all of these cities, all of these unlikely cities are doing really cool stuff. Like you mentioned Mississauga, Daniel. I mean, I've heard about Brampton, you know, other cities in Canada, but like weird cities around the world are just like inventing stuff. They're just they're thinking, man, they're shooting from the hip here. And in this desperate situation, maybe a city with a little less imagination is going, what are they doing over there? Oh my God, like it's really a cool time because we don't know how to handle this. We lock down or we don't, or we lock down on different phases or different, you know, levels. And this is really the time where super cool ideas are, you know, they gain purchase, right? And other cities go, oh my God, they're doing that. One of the darlings for me at the moment is Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. They have a medieval city center. So, and like in Copenhagen here, you know, you have your space outside your bar or your cafe to drink outside, but you're limited to, you know, your zoning or your permit. They said, right, you know, we're just going to open up the entire medieval city center, and it's the world's largest cafe, and we're going to do this during the COVID, and anybody can go out there, and social distancing's in place, so the tables are spaced apart. Like it's just like they made the world's largest cafe bar. I mean, that's just cool. So like all these, I think what we're going to remember is the cities that did the cool stuff, not the cities that failed to act, that were a bit slow, a bit like, oh, I don't know, that's a bit crazy for us. I don't know. Well, they did that. Oh, that's not really our style. I think that we're going to really remember the cities that just rocked it and just went next level with their creative thinking. And, you know, the people in that meeting who decided to do that in Vilnius, or in the New Zealand government who decided to do that. I think they're going to be the legends, man. They're going to be like doing these Zoom things like for the next, you know, 20 years, man. We're going to want to hear from them and how they did it and why they did it.
And I urge us to look past the usual suspects that, like you said, these random places and, you know, beyond the Western world. I remember early in COVID, there was cities in India where they had traffic guards like performing, you know, social distancing, and that, you know, so let's look beyond Western Europe and North America and see what the strategies are. So expand our what's possible.
Good ideas. We have a question. Man, doesn't matter where they're from. Sorry, good ideas travel. It doesn't matter where they're from.
Yeah,
sure. We got to look all over the planet now. So yeah, there's lots of ideas out there.
There's this inevitable question that we talk about, that money that comes up with change, that we've got someone address who's asked around what are the impacts essentially of lower tax revenues for cities relative to the financing of change and financing projects such as temporary bike lanes. Were cities going to make these investments? How do we sort of stomach these investments if we don't have the revenues that we had pre-COVID?
I think, sorry.
Go ahead, yeah.
I think we're realizing, I'm not an economist. I really am the worst guy at math. I don't really care about any of this stuff. But we're realizing that, man, there's money out there, like in the government, right? All of a sudden, we're like pulling money out of nowhere to do all of these things that we need to do. And I think, you know, this is super interesting when you don't care about economy and finance and math, and you go, wait, there was money there? Like, you know, that was, you know, we can use for this kind of stuff. I mean, I think the financial issue, we're realizing like, man, there is money for stuff. And if you talk about pop-up bike lanes, and this is part of my job, it's like, you know, for the price, like if we talk about Toronto, because you're all in Toronto, for the price of 10 kilometers of 6-lane freeway, you could completely transform Toronto into the world's most bicycle-friendly city. That's how cheap it is to actually make proper separated bicycle infrastructure. 10 kilometers of freeway. I've done that. And now we're realizing pop-up bike lanes, wow. You know, Toronto's lame at this. You put out some barrels and stuff like where other cities are sort of really taking the space, right? But man, we're realizing it's super cheap what we're doing at the moment, man. And once we take that space, we reallocate that urban space, which is, you know, a democratic space, which was given to cars in the 1950s in like a transportation dictatorship. We're taking back this space, we're redemocratizing it and doing it on the cheap, man. This is like a dollar store version of bike lanes, but we're taking the space, we're marking it, you know, we're peeing on it. This is our territory, and boom, it's going to be so much easier to make it permanent later on. And I think, you know, for me, the money involved in doing cool stuff right now, man, it is nothing compared to the benefit we're going to have later on.
Definitely.
Candice, you want
Yeah,
to,
I
yeah.
completely agree. I was gonna try to, reference back to some of the transit advocacy that we've been working on. And it was mentioned at the top, but yes, this is unprecedented times, and COVID's really illuminating, where a lot of these major economic struggles and disconnected systems that we have, not only infrastructurally, but also like processes. So one of the main things that I've been thinking about a lot is just transit, and how most transit systems around the world, but specifically in Toronto, rely incredibly heavily on fare compensation to fund transit capital projects, operation budgets, things like that. And in these months, we've seen a huge decline in people taking transit, obviously, not paying fares, and, that's lost revenue. That revenue is like what our transit commissions have budgeted for to pay, operating staff, which is why we're seeing, 1,200 TBC employees being laid off. So these are, gaps in our system. But to Michael's point, if we're looking at our cities with a human-centric view of where we can best support, the people working to make our urban system run, then we allocate that money accordingly.
Yeah, COVID has shown like what's possible. It's like all these things that we previously thought were not possible. And I know in Toronto, there are efforts to house the people experiencing homelessness, but whether or not they're doing that effectively, but even just the political ability to talk about that, and we need to push that forward. Like, we need to make sure that these conversations are brought through COVID and after and into the new world. And I know right before this, like, conversations about free transit were we were talking all about free transit, and I know some cities in Southern Ontario and around the world during this time have operated with a free transit model, and there's all these economic cases, and the data wonks will tell you why it could happen and why it can't. But I just think that we're seeing things that are possible that we never thought were before. So that's the positive bringing forward.
And I think once there's a priority put on something, there's always going to be a means to get it done and to get things happening.
Yeah.
So I think whatever it is that we put our minds to it, whether it needs to be bike lanes or whether it needs to be free transit or whether it needs to be whatever else, if there's a means and if there's enough people behind it, there will be a way to get it done.
Agreed. Enough human beings who are voters who put effort and push for change. There's definitely a difference in terms of moving decision makers or getting things to shift in a different direction. If in the face of being like explicit and Daniel, you were mentioning like what we have to do and who we have to address, like who and how has COVID affected different types of users and mobility? Like, I think it's also, we have to be very explicit in name and be, who are the users who are most positively impacted and negatively impacted and why? Because I think it helps in terms of our response too, if we don't divorce who's actually experiencing the impact and both the positive or the negative.
Well, Candice, we were at the panelists, we're talking about the parks, the different park experiences. Maybe we could talk about that.
That'd be great.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so I live in Scarborough, which is a community in Toronto. I live pretty close to one of like the designated area improvement neighborhoods in Scarborough. And yeah, it's been really interesting to see the amount of police presence in our public spaces. Thompson Memorial Park is a huge, fantastic, one of my favorite parks in the city. It's not comparable to, a Hyde Park, but in terms of the capacity and the potential for the public space programming and the attractiveness of it all, they're fairly comparable. And yeah, I've just seen a lot of police presence, that looming, and just general fears that people have to venture out to a public space like that.
And just as an example, or a different example related to this, we were talking the panelists before we got on the call with everyone. In contrast, I live downtown Toronto. Bathurst and Bloor have Christie Pitts, very large downtown park. Tons of folks always there. I'm out, try to get out to a walk, and tend to walk around there almost every day. I haven't seen one bylaw officer yet.
Yeah, and I live on Toronto Island, and it's a great I know in the next phase of how we operate in the city, you know, it's the ferry is closed to people and people here have access to this large green space, but you know, that's the kind of thing we need access to. So I think in the next phase of the COVID world, it's going to be really important that we talk about accessibility to green space. And I know in Scarborough, there's like a huge amount of green space per resident, but a lot of that is ravines that don't have signage and don't have lit paths and don't have, you know, like people are living right by a ravine, but there's no access to those ravines. So I think that's another place where we can push for access, because proximity to green space doesn't mean access to green space. And that's something that's going to be very important to think about.
That's a great point. One other perspective I wanted to bring to this question, at least, is the future of transit. I talk about transit a lot, but it's something that, you know, impacts me personally, but it also impacts my neighborhood a lot. A lot of residents in Scarborough rely on transit to commute to their essential services, to their jobs and such. And when you think about like what this post-COVID city would look like, we're already anticipating like tons of stigmatization of public transit. Transit has always kind of been deemed as like this unacceptable way of commuting in cities. It's for the poor, it's dirty and things like that. And the fear is real that those outlooks will only be exacerbated moving forward. But the alternative to that is a single occupancy vehicle, which comes with all these other complications around affordability and access to those vehicles. Who can drive those vehicles? You know, kids can't drive cars and things like that. So that's an area of concern moving forward for sure.
Michael, do you want to add to anything onto this question?
Okay, this is a super local conversation about Toronto, which is super interesting because I have a relationship with the city, but I just had a nice experience the other day, okay? I was out, we were allowed to go out here, no more than 10 people together is the rule. And we were talking before the Zoom, it's kind of easing up now, but I was out playing pétanque. You guys call it bocce ball or something, right? But out on a public space. And in this neighborhood, we don't have a big homeless problem here in Copenhagen, but we still have a lot of street people. And man, we were just me and two friends were out there playing, drinking wine and playing pétanque. And the only people we saw were the street people. And we were talking to them like they were everywhere. And they kept walking past and going, you got to watch your bag on the bench. They're warning us about the people who would steal our bags, which is people in their community probably, right? And we had so many conversations with these people because normally they would be, they would fade into the crowd of all the people using the public spaces and bikes riding past and pedestrians and everything. And it was just us and them. And we sat there and we played for like 6 hours and we just talked to so many of these people. So the hidden people, right? The undesirables, right? Like we sat there and engaged with them for like 6 hours and, gave them cigarettes and shared a drink with them. And it was just really the coolest experience I've had during this whole thing is that I interacted with so many of these people that, that I work for in urbanism, and I'm just talking to them all day long, for 6 hours. I think that was really for me, probably the most beautiful poetic experience is connecting with that community of people that we just never think about. We just ride our bikes past, or we, oh yeah, we read about them in the newspapers. And there they were, face to face, super friendly, like the friendliest people on the planet during this crisis, right? And that's all I got there. I just thought I just remembered that, and I thought I want to share that.
That's such a great outlook. And it also makes me think about I know there's a whole other panel around how we move forward with engagement and studying our public spaces to make them better and things. But what you're describing right now, Michael, are like super users of parks, right? They're the people that knows every single, nook and cranny and crevice of these fantastic public spaces. And those are the people, those are the community members, those leaders that will be able to, provide that incredibly insightful information and how to address our public spaces moving forward for sure.
I think a big piece of it is though how we share power within that, because a lot of the time that we talk about, you know, how in our work we talk about local champions and folks who are those local experts, the student homeless folks experiencing homelessness, folks who really have a lot of access to X space that we're looking to study. But how do we actually shift our power in those circumstances to actually share power and redistribute wealth within the face of COVID or in the future? If we're talking about the exacerbation of inequities, well, how do we actually readdress that then?
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose this might actually be a good segue to our final question of our panel, which is how each of you see your advocacy evolving to incorporate COVID considerations and some of the challenges that we've been talking about relative to inequity.
I guess I believe that I will continue to incorporate advocacy for increased space for sidewalks in restaurants or for door thresholds, for park paths, which will reflect the COVID considerations for physical distancing. It will continue to incorporate advocacy for accessible bathrooms on main floors and functioning accessible door buttons at all facilities, which also reflects the COVID considerations for hand washing and overall hygiene. It will also continue to advocate for open dialogues about accessibility and how to reach out and stay connected to those who are homebound with disabilities, which will reflect COVID considerations for staying socially connected and mentally healthy during the social isolation.
I can share mine. So on the transit advocacy side, TDC Riders has been pushing out, petitions and just trying to mobilize individuals around the concerns we have around transit moving forward. One of those is the Keep Transit Moving petition. The keeptransitmoving.ca has all the information, but that really is a petition to draw attention to provincial and federal governments to fund our transit systems accordingly. It says that there's urgent need now, as transit staff members are being laid off, but also fundamentally saying that this process, this system of relying heavily on fares to make our transit operational and expanded isn't sustainable. So we need to really reassess that. On a more urbanisty side, the way that we engage and plan our cities is going to change radically, 100%. So we're going to be looking at that question that you raised earlier, Nadia, in terms of how do we restructure these power dynamics of community leaders, and how can cities be more of a facilitator in urbanist projects and progressive planning measures moving forward? How can the city be a partner in supporting those community leaders, those park super users, and making fantastic spaces for everyone?
Yeah, I think, ironically, because we're socially and physically distancing, I think my advocacy is going to be more connected, and it's going to be because COVID has exposed and emphasized the inequities. It's even more important to collaborate with people outside of your small perspective to see what is going on with them. And when you're advancing certain things like greater access to space for pedestrians, what does that look like for different users in different parts of the cities? So I think my advocacy going forward is going to be even more connected and than it has been. And so the first question, before you prepare a campaign is like, who are the people who are affected by this, and who can I connect with? And that has led my work from this before this moment, but really emphasizes that in this moment of COVID.
I think kind of back to the whistleblower thing, right? COVID's an amazing urbanist whistleblower. We're all sharing a visual, also the emotional, but I mean, like the visual of our cities. I think this is really just, man, we've all seen the light. So I think advocacy generally, I'm hoping that it's going to have an easier time, oh, I went to Copenhagen and I saw 400,000 people literally every day riding bikes, and you go back to your Canadian city, your American city, they're going, oh, well, that's Copenhagen, whatever, that's not here. And I think now we all saw the same thing, man. We saw car-free streets. We saw, or are seeing in some places still. I mean, we're realizing wow, yeah, I get what you're talking about now, man. You know, you're talking about your accessibility, wheelchair users. Yeah, okay, no, now I saw all this empty space and I realized, okay, yeah, that's hard for a wheelchair user. Or, you know, I see, wow, that is a narrow sidewalk there. Never thought about it before because I was busy trying to navigate through the city with cars and pedestrians. Everybody just had this sort of like this epiphany going, huh, okay, yeah. And I think that is going to make advocacy, and I'm really hoping, I'm always always the optimist. I think it's going to be easier because we're going to go, you remember like what you saw during COVID? Yeah, totally, dude. I saw that. Yeah. And that's important because, so I just think that COVID could be the opportunity for advocacy, all of advocacy in urbanism, and everything you guys are talking about, all the amazing work that you do. I think this is like going, yeah, we all have a shared experience now. We all saw the same thing. You didn't come to Copenhagen with me and see all the people riding bikes. You can't share that. You have no idea what I'm talking about. But man, we all saw the same thing in our neighborhood, in our city, and we can work together towards making that different. There's going to be like some ears that are open now that, you know, that were not open before. And I think just generally I'm optimistic about how we're going to approach advocacy, all levels of advocacy. We're going to have people listening to us that never listened to us before. And I think really that's probably for me the biggest win with this horrible crisis is that we're going to have some really cool opportunities. I guess.
And my last question for you folks, what are your top priorities for like personally? What's your top priority for the shift in mobility for the future in with this opportunity that COVID provides us?
More space for pedestrians.
That was low-hanging fruit for you.
Yeah.
One thing I can think about, you know, constantly, that's what really grounds my work, is just like looking out for our friends and family and our loved ones right now. You know, we can say that COVID has really brought, you know, this new light. It's been this new whistleblower, and it has, you know, successfully drawn a lot of attention to areas of concern. But really understanding that a lot of people are grieving during these times, and how we move forward is also going to be a huge challenge on people subjectively. In terms of advocacy, it's really, you know, trying to capitalize on this moment of saying, you know, these systems did not work. The way that we've funded our transit right now does not work, and using that to motivate us moving forward.
Probably building on the social isolation for those who are homebound with disabilities. Seeing that there's already movement in that with the COVID, I think that would be a good one to go with, because especially with the mental health and everything like that, with brain injuries, I think that's a good one to build on.
Good question. I don't know. I think like for me, like, how do you evolve it? I don't know. I just think it's just like, you know, hammering it now, right? Like starting conversations that, you know, with that very skeptical municipality there or whatnot. I think really the evolution for me is like back to my previous response was like, people are going to listen now, you know, and we also have to be careful not to be like too like, you know, you never listen to me and now I'm going to talk forever about this subject. We also got to be careful that we don't sort of, you know, in your face it with people, because there's going to be a lot of people talking about, you know, things afterwards. But I think the evolution for me is just like, this is the chance. You know, I've been communicating back and forth with the city of Milan, well, not the city of Milan, but like activists in Milan who are, you know, who are being critical about certain infrastructure they're putting in and stuff. And, you know, just doing this pro bono, just doing it because I got nothing else to do. So, I mean, you know, I'm just sort of, you know, saying, yeah, let's do this, man. Let's transform a massive European city, because they're doing it and they got to do it right. If it's going to stick, they got to do it right. So I think for me, evolving this conversation is just simply using this experience. And really, it's also, you know, you're in the COVID, we're all in this situation. Denmark's easing up at the moment, but like if you look at the Spanish flu, you look at the graph, like it kind of went up at the beginning and then it went boom, like 6-8 months later, right? So we're not out of the woods yet. So this is also like, that's nasty, of course. But I mean, if we're talking urbanism, which we are, I mean, this is an opportunity to say, well, what if it happens again, right? What if it happens next year and it comes back and it mutates and we're screwed on a level that we never even imagined we were screwed? We got to start acting. So I think we have, you know, the evolution is like, what if? And what ifism is horrible. But I mean, like, you know, this is like, what if it happens? We have to do this now. We have to transform now to prepare for the future if this kind of thing happens again. I think, man, the evolution is just realizing that, man, this is the time that we can change things that would have been tied up in city councils for years previously, right? So I think it's sort of more, it's just game face. That's the evolution. Get your game face.
I think like that makes me think, you know, about, you know, a lot of these people are going to be saying, oh, finally listening to what we've been saying for a long time. But I think in terms of how advocacy is going to look moving forward, we're going to see new people saying that, right? We're going to see these people that have been deemed heroes and, you know, really put on a pedestal, these frontline workers, grocery store workers, things like that, that are now going to have this lived experience of being on the front lines. And I think they're going to be a huge, huge asset in moving this, this movement forward, for sure.
There were some cities, sorry to jump in, there were some cities that made their bike share system free for all of the, what you call the first line workers, you know. So yeah, I mean, these are people that need to get around a city. It's mobility, it's A to B and in a hurry more than maybe us, right? So like, yeah, there's opportunities there. Absolutely. Good point.
We're so connected and we rely so much on each other, and especially folks that, to the points earlier, have not had as much credit in the past, and hopefully that's the shift, one of the significant shifts in the future. And folks, this has been a really great conversation, but unfortunately we're out of time, so we're going to have to wrap up our discussion for today. So I want to thank each of you so much. Philiz, Candice, Mikael, Daniel, thank you for each of your enthusiasm, your insights, and the open discussion. And to our viewers, a huge thanks for tuning in, sending in your thoughtful questions, and we hope you've enjoyed the discussion as much as we have. Mobility services, they're vital to the function of our cities. Yet, as we noted, there's a significant social inequities with respect to urban mobility. The pandemic is only poised to widen these inequalities. So a progressive urban response to COVID and mobility, we need to include that to correct these disparities and be ready to discuss larger systemic barriers that residents face. So a post-pandemic world really does have the potential for better, more equitable urban mobility options than the world we knew before. But we need to really empower leaders to make smart decisions to get us there tomorrow, and communities as a key part of that. So before we say goodbye, just a couple of parting notes. So number one, so everyone's in the know, Jane's Walk Festival panel is recording all of these, the Jane's Walk Festival folks are recording all these panels, and they're going to be available for viewing up on the Jane's Walk Toronto website. So feel free to share this experience with others, or hey, rewatch it yourself. And number two, be sure to check out the next panel entitled "Whose Space Is It?", which is taking place later today at 4 p.m. You'll find more details about that panel on the Jane's Walk Toronto Festival website. So that officially wraps up our panel today. A big thanks again to our panelists and for all our viewers for participating. I hope to see you virtually again and hopefully in person sometime soon.
Yes.
Thank you for moderating.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
All the best.
Bye.
One last thing I should mention. Oh, have we lost everybody? Oh,
Okay,
for
no.
folks who are still on the call, I have one note here that I forgot to do. It would be really great before you hang up. Things that might be top of mind for our viewers tuning in before you sign out. Things that you're leaving with that perhaps inspire you, or a word that describes what you're feeling right now. Before you tune out, if you can type that in, that would be really great. I'll count down for us. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Too fast. Shit.
I know, that was so fast.
Okay, I'll go again. 3, 2, 1. I did start at 5. Check in with your loved ones. That's great. Elated, hopeful, opportunity. I've seen hopeful a few times. Opportunities, inspired, game face, share space. Okay, I think we're officially going to say goodbye. Everyone who we haven't heard your voice, we wish you we had, and we thank you for joining. All the best, folks.
Yes,
Thanks.
thank you.
Bye.